Well, here we are at episode 11 already in this mini series that I've been doing about the music of Paul McCartney through the decades. This man just keeps churning out incredible music. Now, I've been looking mainly at his albums, not so much his singles, because a lot of times the singles then appear on an album. So far, we've looked at the albums that he's released in the 1960s, and in the 70s, and in the 80s, and in the 90s, and then his fifth decade in the 2000s. Now we turn to his sixth decade, the decade that starts with 2010. Let's see what Paul's up to in this decade. Are you ready? Let's drop the needle. At the start of this decade in 2010, Paul is 68 years old. And so what does he do? He decides to go on another massive world tour, and his concerts run over 3 hours. The man is a born showman. In 2011, Paul is commissioned by the New York City Ballet to create a dance score, which he does with Peter Martins, and the album is called Ocean's Kingdom. It's released October 4th in the US, and it's Paul's fifth classical album. The ballet is a love story based on two worlds, the pure ocean kingdom and the earth kingdom, which has some baddies in it. Paul has said, love happens when earth meets water. Well, I guess you'll have to listen to the album or perhaps watch the ballet to see how our couple fares out. 5 days later, after the release of this album, October the 9th of 2011, Paul marries Nancy Shevell in London. He's known her for almost 20 years. Just in time for Valentine's Day in 2012, the newly married Paul McCartney, always the romantic, decides to release an album called Kisses on the Bottom. It's an album of traditional pop and jazz. There are only two new Paul McCartney compositions on the record. Paul has said that the inspiration for him to make this album was as a kid growing up, they would always have family sing-arounds around the piano, and he remembers these songs from that period. Tracks I like include I'm Going to Sit Right Down and Write Myself a Letter, It's Only a Paper Moon, We Three, My Echo, My Shadow, and Me, the great Accentuate the Positive. Then there's My Valentine, which is a McCartney composition that during his live show he dedicates to his wife Nancy. Only Our Hearts, another Paul McCartney composition. The album hit number 3 in the UK and 5 in the US Billboard charts and number 1 on the Billboard Jazz Albums chart. Then on 12/12/12, Paul teams up with the surviving members of Nirvana to play a concert, the Sandy Relief Concert, which is broadcast worldwide, TV and movie theaters, and on the internet, and it's estimated that over 2 billion people watched the concert. A CD and a DVD came out shortly thereafter. Then Paul takes a bit of a break. It takes him a while to record his next new album, and that's what he calls it, New. It was released in October 2013. The album contains all new material. Paul wants this album to be contemporary, so he decides to work with 4 different producers on the record, although Giles Martin does most of the production work. On the 10th of October, just a day before the album is released, Paul and his band play a surprise concert in New York, and the concert only has 4 songs that they perform, all from the new album. Tracks that I like are Save Us, On My Way to Work, Queenie Eye, Early Days, Everybody Out There, a song that Paul wrote so that he could perform it live in concert and get the audience to respond to him. Hosanna, Looking at Her, Road, and then there's a hidden track called Scared. The album hits number 3 both in the UK and the US. Then, just a month later, in November of 2013, we get a new Beatles album. Well, kind of. It is the Beatles Live at the BBC Volume 2, and like the first BBC volume of the Beatles, this contains music that they performed on the BBC radio between 1963 and 1964. Most of the songs come from their first 4 albums, Please Please Me, with the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, and Beatles for Sale. But there are many covers of rock songs that they often played live in their early days. Songs by Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and Buddy Holly. There are also 2 songs on the album that had never been released, Dream Baby, How Long Must I Dream, and A Picture of You, and both of these feature Pete Best on drums. Then just a month later, at the end of 2013, there is another Beatles compilation album that comes out, and this one has an interesting backstory to it. The album is called Beatles Bootleg Recordings, 1963, and it contains 59 previously unreleased Beatles recordings. The record was put together and released for the purpose of extending the copyright of these 1963 recordings under EU law by 20 years, as EU law protects recordings for 70 years, only if they are formally released. There are multiple takes of songs, so maybe you've heard the song before, but not necessarily this take. So by releasing this take, it's copyrighted. There are also lots of songs from the BBC sessions that weren't released, again different takes, and a couple of interesting John Lennon demos. Bad to Me, later recorded by Billy J. Kramer in the Dakotas, and I'm in Love, later recorded by The Foremost. In 2014, Paul decides, let's go on tour again. And again, it's another massive tour. But at the end of the tour, the very last concert he plays is in Candlestick Park in San Francisco. Now you remember, Candlestick Park was the place where the Beatles played their last concert for a paying audience back in 1966. And then in November of 2014, a new album comes out that is all about Paul McCartney, but he's not on it. The album is called Art of McCartney. There are 42 songs on this, and they were all written by Paul, either while he was in the Beatles, or Wings, or as a solo artist. And they are interpreted by a wide group of artists. Tracks that I like are Brian Wilson, who does Wonderlist, Steve Miller, who performs Junior's Farm, Bob Dylan doing Things We Said Today, Willie Nelson's doing Yesterday, Alice Cooper, he's doing Eleanor Rigby, Jeff Lynne is doing Junk, and then Roger Daltrey does Helter Skelter, which is appropriate because Paul wrote Helter Skelter for the Beatles to record because he wanted them to do a song that was louder than The Who's I Can See for Miles. I also like Smokey Robinson doing No More Lonely Nights, Kiss doing Venus and Mars and Rock Show, and Dion doing Drive My Car. This is a very interesting album. I know I started out this episode saying I'm going to concentrate on albums, not so much on singles, but I am going to mention 2 that Paul does in this period because they are both pretty unique and very unexpected from Paul McCartney. The first single is a collaboration with Kanye West called Only One, and the second single, released in January 2015, is a collaboration with West and Rihanna on 4-5 Seconds. Now, who would have expected this from Paul McCartney? In 2015, Paul appears on the 40th anniversary of Saturday Night Live, and then he joins with Alice Cooper and the band The Hollywood Vampires to play Come and Get It on their debut album. You know, in the last episode, I asked for help because one of you guys had suggested, wouldn't it be a great idea if I could actually interview Paul on a Zoom call or something for the last episode that we do of this series? Well, I have reached out to him on his website. But as I said in the last episode, if any of you guys know anybody who knows Paul McCartney and can get a hold of him, or if you know Paul McCartney, can you reach out to him? It would be really cool if we could get him to sit for a quick little interview as we end this mini-series, which is still a few episodes off. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. Not a bad start from Paul for the first part of 2010, the decade of 2010. In our next episode, we'll see what he does between 2015 and 2020. And you know, with Paul McCartney, it's always going to be a bit of a surprise, and it's always going to be good. Thanks for watching, and keep a rockin'.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.